Mesopotamia is a name for the area of the Tigris-Euphrates river system, roughly corresponding to modern-day Iraq, Syria and Kuwait, including regions along the Turkish-Syrian and Iran-Iraq borders. Widely considered to be one of the cradles of civilization by the Western world, Bronze Age Mesopotamia included Sumer and the Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian empires, all native to the territory of modern-day Iraq. In the Iron Age, it was controlled by the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires. The indigenous Sumerians and Akkadians dominated Mesopotamia from the beginning of written history to the fall of Babylon in 539 BC, when it was conquered by the Achaemenid Empire. It fell to Alexander the Great in 332 BC, and after his death, it became part of the Greek Seleucid Empire. Around 150 BC, Mesopotamia was under the control of the Parthian Empire. Mesopotamia became a battleground between the Romans and Parthians, with parts of Mesopotamia coming under ephemeral Roman control. In AD 226, it fell to the Sassanid Persians and remained under Persian rule until the 7th century Muslim conquest of Persia of the Sasanian Empire. A number of primarily Neo-Assyrian and Christian native Mesopotamian states existed between the 1st century BC and 3rd century AD, including Adiabene, Osron, and Hatra. Mesopotamia is the site of the earliest developments of the Neolithic Revolution from around 10,000 BC. It has been identified as having inspired some of the most important developments in human history, including the invention of the wheel, the planting of the first cereal crops, and the development of cursive script, mathematics, astronomy and agriculture. A modern Mesopotamian identity is espoused by the ethnically indigenous Mesopotamian and Eastern Aramaic-speaking people, known as Assyrians and Chaldean Christians. Etymology. The regional toponym Mesopotamia comes from the ancient Greek root words mu epsilon sigma omicron sigma middle, and pi omicron tau alpha mu omicron sigma river, and literally means between rivers. It is used throughout the Greek Septuagint to translate the Hebrew equivalent Naharaim. An even earlier Greek usage of the name Mesopotamia is evident from the Anabasis of Alexander, which was written in the late 2nd century AD, but specifically refers to sources from the time of Alexander the Great. In the Anabasis, Mesopotamia was used to designate the land east of the Euphrates in North Syria. The Aramaic term Bairitum, Narim, corresponded to a similar geographical concept. Later, the term Mesopotamia was more generally applied to all the lands between the Euphrates and the Tigris, thereby incorporating not only parts of Syria but also almost all of Iraq and southeastern Turkey. The neighboring steppes to the west of the Euphrates and the western part of the Zagros Mountains are also often included under the wider term Mesopotamia. A further distinction is usually made between northern or Upper Mesopotamia and southern or Lower Mesopotamia. Upper Mesopotamia, also known as the Jazara, is the area between the Euphrates and the Tigris from their sources down to Baghdad. Lower Mesopotamia consists of southern Iraq, Kuwait and parts of western Iran. In modern academic usage, the term Mesopotamia often also has a chronological connotation. It is usually used to designate the area until the Muslim conquests, with names like Syria, Jazara, and Iraq being used to describe the region after that date. It has been argued that these later euphemisms are Eurocentric terms attributed to the region in the midst of various 19th-century Western encroachments. Geography. Mesopotamia encompasses the land between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, both of which have their headwaters in the Armenian highlands. Both rivers are fed by numerous tributaries, and the entire river system drains a vast mountainous region. Overland routes in Mesopotamia usually follow the Euphrates because the banks of the Tigris are frequently steep and difficult. The climate of the region is semi-arid with a vast desert expanse in the north which gives way to a 15,000 square kilometers region of marshes, lagoons, mudflats, and reed banks in the south. In the extreme south, the Euphrates and the Tigris unite and empty into the Persian Gulf. The arid environment, which ranges from the northern areas of rain-fed agriculture to the south where irrigation of agriculture is essential if a surplus energy returned on energy invested is to be obtained. This irrigation is aided by a high water table and by melting snows from the high peaks of the northern Zagros Mountains and from the Armenian highlands, the source of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that give the region its name. The usefulness of irrigation depends upon the ability to mobilize sufficient labor for the construction and maintenance of canals, and this, from the earliest period, has assisted the development of urban settlements and centralized systems of political authority. Agriculture throughout the region has been supplemented by nomadic pastoralism, where tent-dwelling nomads herded sheep and goats from the river pastures in the dry summer months out into seasonal grazing lands on the desert fringe in the wet winter season. The area is generally lacking in building stone, precious metals and timber, and so historically has relied upon long-distance trade of agricultural products to secure these items from outlying areas. In the marshlands to the south of the area, a complex waterborne fishing culture has existed since prehistoric times, and has added to the cultural mix. Periodic breakdowns in the cultural system have occurred for a number of reasons. The demands for labor has from time to time led to population increases that push the limits of the ecological carrying capacity. And should a period of climatic instability ensue, collapsing central government and declining populations can occur. Alternatively, military vulnerability to invasion from marginal hill tribes or nomadic pastoralists has led to periods of trade collapse and neglect of irrigation systems. Equally, centripetal tendencies amongst city-states has meant that central authority over the whole region, when imposed, has tended to be ephemeral, and localism has fragmented power into tribal or smaller regional units. These trends have continued to the present day in Iraq. History. The prehistory of the ancient Near East begins in the Lower Paleolithic period, but writing began with a pictographic script in the Uruk IV period, and the documented record of actual historical events, and the ancient history of Lower Mesopotamia, commence in the mid-3rd millennium BC with cuneiform records of early dynastic kings, and ends with either the arrival of the Achaemenid Empire in the late 6th century BC, or with the Muslim conquest and the establishment of the Caliphate in the late 7th century AD, from which point the region came to be known as Iraq. During this period, Mesopotamia housed some of the world's most ancient, highly developed and socially complex states. The region was one of the 4 riverine civilizations where writing was invented, along with the Nile Valley in Egypt, the Indus Valley Civilization in the Indian subcontinent, and the Yellow River in China. Mesopotamia housed historically important cities such as Uruk, Nippur, Nineveh, Ashur and Babylon, as well as major territorial states such as the city of Eridu, the Akkadian kingdoms, the 3rd dynasty of Ur, and the various Assyrian empires. Some of the important historical Mesopotamian leaders were Ur-Nammu, Sargon of Akkad, Hammurabi, Ashurbanipal II and Tiglath-Pileser I. Studies have reported that most Irish and Britons are descendants of farmers who left modern-day Iraq and Syria 10,000 years ago. Genetic researchers say they have found compelling evidence that 4 out of 5 white Europeans can trace their roots to the Near East. In another study, scientists analyzed DNA from the 8,000-year-old remains of early farmers found at an ancient graveyard in Germany. They compared the genetic signatures to those of modern populations and found similarities with the DNA of people living in today's Turkey and Iraq. Periodization: Pre- and Protohistory, Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, Hassuna. Sumerian Halaf cultures, Ubaid period, Uruk period, Jemdet Nasa period, Early Bronze Age, Early Dynastic period, Akkadian Empire, 3rd dynasty of Ur, Early Assyrian Kingdom, Middle Bronze Age, Early Babylonia, 1st Babylonian dynasty, Minoan eruption, Late Bronze Age, Old Assyrian period, Middle Assyrian period, Kassites in Babylon, Late Bronze Age, collapse, Iron Age, Syro-Hittite states, Neo-Assyrian Empire, Neo-Babylonian Empire, Classical Antiquity, Persian Babylonia, Achaemenid Assyria, Seleucid Mesopotamia, Parthian Babylonia, Osron Adiabene Hatra, Roman Mesopotamia, Roman Assyria, Late Antiquity, Asaristan, Muslim conquest, language and writing. The earliest language written in Mesopotamia was Sumerian, an agglutinative language isolate. Along with Sumerian, Semitic languages were also spoken in early Mesopotamia. Sub-Echan, a language of the Zagros, perhaps related to the Hurro-Urartian language family, is attested in personal names, rivers and mountains, and in various crafts. Akkadian came to be the dominant language during the Akkadian Empire and the Assyrian empires, but Sumerian was retained for administrative, religious, literary and scientific purposes. Different varieties of Akkadian were used until the end of the Neo-Babylonian period. Old Aramaic, which had already become common in Mesopotamia, then became the official provincial administration language of first the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and then the Achaemenid Empire. The official lect is called Imperial Aramaic. Akkadian fell into disuse, but both it and Sumerian were still used in temples for some centuries. The last Akkadian texts date from the late 1st century AD. Early in Mesopotamia's history, cuneiform was invented for the Sumerian language. Cuneiform literally means wedge-shaped, due to the triangular tip of the stylus used for impressing signs on wet clay. The standardized form of each cuneiform sign appears to have been developed from pictograms. The earliest texts come from the E8 temple dedicated to the goddess Inanna at Uruk, from a building labeled as Temple C by its excavators. The early logographic system of cuneiform script took many years to master. Thus, only a limited number of individuals were hired as scribes to be trained in its use. It was not until the widespread use of a syllabic script was adopted under Sargon's rule that significant portions of Mesopotamian population became literate. During the 3rd millennium BC, there developed a very intimate cultural symbiosis between the Sumerian and the Akkadian language users, which included widespread bilingualism. The influence of Sumerian on Akkadian is evident in all areas, from lexical borrowing on a massive scale, to syntactic, morphological, and phonological convergence. This has prompted scholars to refer to Sumerian and Akkadian in the 3rd millennium as a Sprachbund. Akkadian gradually replaced Sumerian as the spoken language of Mesopotamia, somewhere around the turn of the 3rd and the 2nd millennium BC. But Sumerian continued to be used as a sacred, ceremonial, literary, and scientific language in Mesopotamia until the 1st century AD. Literature libraries were extant in towns and temples during the Babylonian Empire. An old Sumerian proverb averred that, "He who would excel in the school of the scribes must rise with the dawn." Women as well as men learned to read and write. And for the Semitic Babylonians, this involved knowledge of the extinct Sumerian language, and a complicated and extensive syllabary. A considerable amount of Babylonian literature was translated from Sumerian originals, and the language of religion and law long continued to be the old agglutinative language of Sumer. Vocabularies, grammars, and interlinear translations were compiled for the use of students, as well as commentaries on the older texts and explanations of obscure words and phrases. The characters of the syllabary were all arranged and named, and elaborate lists were drawn up. Many Babylonian literary works are still studied today. One of the most famous of these was the Epic of Gilgamesh, in 12 books, translated from the original Sumerian by a certain Sin-Leqi-Unani, and arranged upon an astronomical principle. Each division contains the story of a single adventure in the career of Gilgamesh. The whole story is a composite product, although it is probable that some of the stories are artificially attached to the central figure.